Chapter 42. Tyrell grumbled quietly as the four of them walked to the center of the platform. Jake's head bobbed slightly as he made a soft clicking noise. The central platform was only a few inches higher than the docking area. It had a diameter of approximately 20 feet, and its construction consisted of metallic rings that narrowed more and more as they progressed toward the central disk. "Let me explain how this works," Jake said. "I don't want another situation like we had earlier." "What situation was that?" Callie asked. He ignored her. "It will only activate when a single person is standing in the very center. The rest of you have to be standing on the same outer ring. It doesn't matter which one. A two-stage tractor beam will lock onto the person in the middle and one other ring, which is selected by the person in the center. First, anyone on the platform will be raised up to the top of the auxiliary dock, and then the second stage will lock onto anyone standing on that second ring and bring them the rest of the way to the ship. If anyone isn't on the correct ring when it switches, they will fall." Callie let her thoughts flow through the weaver as she attempted to communicate with the Darkling. She knew it couldn't understand what was being said, and doubted the beam could lock onto an object which lacked physicality. "I'm guessing something dropped while you were figuring this all out." "No real harm came of it," Jake said. "So, I see no point in discussing the circumstances." "It must have been one of the twins," Shinji quipped. Tyrell and Jake looked at Callie, who wasn't paying any attention. "Okay, this is starting to bother me now," Shinji said nervously. "What's wrong?" Tyrell asked. "Where is all this light actually coming from?" Shinji asked with a hint of suspicion in his tone. "The walls," Jake said. "The coating provides enough luminescence to light the chamber without being bright enough to interfere with anyone's vision." "Why do you ask?" "What is Syntholo doing?" Shinji asked. "He's on the bridge," Jake tilted his head slightly as he answered. "Is there a point to this line of questioning?" "Hang on," Tyrell said with a start. "You're sure he's on the bridge?" "Perhaps not the main bridge, but yes," Jake insisted. "Then I'm not the only one that's noticed," Shinji said. "I was starting to think my eyes were playing tricks on me." "I had a discussion with Syntholo a while back," Tyrell said. "He told me he could take the form of a shadow, so I had just assumed it was him." "You assumed what was him?" Jake asked. "The shadow that's been following us," Shinji said as he pointed to a darkened spot on the floor. "I see nothing there," Jake remarked. Tyrell said, "I see it too. I guess it's beyond your species' visual spectrum." "You really don't see anything there?" Tyrell pointed to the same darkened patch of ground. "Please," Jake said, "would you both point to this supposed shadow at the same time, so I can be sure of what we're discussing?" They both pointed at the dark patch and followed it with their fingers as it moved. Jake chittered loudly. "Oh, you see it as a shadow? That's just a beep." He clenched his fists at the sound. "It's an atmospheric anomaly, which must be beyond the wavelengths which are visible to Terrans. They were common occurrences on the planet I was raised on. I tend to ignore them." The early settlers were superstitious and believed that they were the spirits of the people who died during the first colonization attempt. The word they used means glowing spirit. "Kind of like Anabi," Shinji said. "You must be from a traditionalist family," Tyrell snickered. "I'm guessing that's the same thing as will-o-wisp." "You use words that my translator does not know," Jake said. "The word is irrelevant, the concept is what's important," Tyrell said. "Our cultures have words for similar phenomena to what you described, but what we see is different." "Callie," Shinji asked, "what do you see?" She didn't answer. "She's off in her own little world," Tyrell teased. "Callie," Shinji thought her name while speaking it aloud. "Oh, I'm sorry," Callie said with a blush, "I was busy." "What did you say?" I asked if you'd do thy thing and tell me what you see over there, Shinji said as he motioned toward the darkling's shadow. I've agreed not to do that, she said dismissively. Agreed, Tyrell asked. With whom? Tyrell and Shinji asked in unison. Or what? Jake added. It's just my new shadow, Callie said with a mischievous grin. Unfortunately, it doesn't trust me yet, so I've made special arrangements to bring it onto the ship. We need to give docking clearance to one of the Cletharian fighters. Now that I can do, Tyrell said with a smile. It doesn't require core access. Can you make sure they don't get sucked into the floor? Callie said. I don't want them to get the wrong impression. Wouldn't that be them making the wrong impression? Tyrell asked with a chuckle. Callie smirked. Okay, fine, Tyrell grumbled. I can make a ramp so they can exit once they've landed, but I can't override that system from here. Do you know if they're one-man fighters? Callie attempted to pass the question through the Weaver, but the Clether didn't seem to understand her, even with the Nautiloid's help. She decided to try adapting the verses of their old Queen song to suit her needs. Friendship's greed brings friendship's need. All things buried within the grass, rise again to be salvation asked. Shadow follow at the rear, horsemen ride through fires sear. The only response she felt was confusion throughout her fraction of the Cletharian collective. You want to bring Cletharians here, Shinji said in dismay. Have you lost your mind? As long as they recognize her as their queen, Tyrell said, we should be safe. They seemed to respond to her well while we were on the shuttle, Jake said. One of the creatures even sacrificed itself to save us. Although I'm not sure how the other kinds of Cletharians feel about us. Tyrell eyed him with suspicion and asked, how do you know there's more than one kind? Are you basing that conclusion on the variants in their ship designs? It's pretty obvious, Jake scoffed. She certainly doesn't intend to invite one of those giant, beep, down here. They live in space. There must be more than one variety. Like in many insect colonies where there is a queen, there are typically workers and drones which perform specific tasks. Quiet, Callie roared, I need to concentrate. They watched her silently, albeit annoyed, while she attempted to communicate with the Clether. If they're half as good at piloting as the rumors claim, they should be able to hover above the central platform and drop off one of their crew members, Tyrell said. Granted, I'm working under the assumption that those aren't one-man fighters, based entirely on their ship's design. Callie glared at him. What? Stop distracting me. All this for a beep, Jake said, and then motioned toward the darkling to indicate what the untranslated word was referencing. Tyrell and Shinji both replied with a different word describing the same phenomenon. Why do you try to correct me? Jake asked. I thought we agreed the meaning is the key, not the words. Callie scolded herself silently. This must be what Kayla had been trying to teach her. Callie was looking at this all wrong. She'd been attempting to bend the collective to her will, expecting obedience instead of cooperation. She'd been too busy instructing and hadn't stopped to consider listening. Maybe then they'd understand her desires, instead of getting bogged down in mere words. She reached out through the Weaver and felt for the minds of the insectal Clether. At first, she felt nothing except for a faint pulse emanating from them. It was the rhythm of the John's ancient verses, still flowing through them. All that was missing was the lyrics of the old queen. What is that noise? Jake asked. We call it humming, Tyrell answered. It's music without words, caused by vibration in a person's throat. I'm surprised you've never heard it before. I have, but this is different, Jake said. I feel like I've heard the tune somewhere, Shinji said with a shrug, but I don't know where. Tyrell listened to Callie's tune for a moment, then added, it's not very musical. It sounds like she's trying to hum along with a drumbeat more than an actual song. I can feel the sound vibration passing through my exoskeleton. Jake shuddered. It's an awkward sensation. That should do it, Callie smiled as she looked up. One of the Cletharian fighters was maneuvering into position far above them. We're inviting Cletharians onto our ship, Shinji muttered. I don't have a good feeling about this. They haven't killed us yet, Jake noted. You're the only telepath on board, other than the Queen over there. If I were you, I'd be worried, too. Why him? Tyrell asked. Shouldn't we all be guarded? While studying other species, I was tasked with isolating the genes responsible for telepathy, Jake explained. My superiors hoped we'd find a way to revive the ability within our people and undo an atrocity from our ancient past. What happened? Tyrell asked. Did you manage to find the genes that govern telepathy? Shinji asked excitedly. There was too much variance, Jake said to Shinji before returning his attention to Tyrell. After my people began venturing into space, a portion of our population started exhibiting strange aberrations. It was awakening telepathic abilities which had long been dormant. When they returned to our homeworld, it began to spread among the population. People that had lived their entire lives on the surface of Lochist began exhibiting the same symptoms. We treated it like a plague. They didn't respond to treatment, so our next course of action was to ship them off to remote worlds under the guise of colonization. The planets we sent them to weren't exactly habitable. That's horrible, Shinji said. It's better than death squads, Tyrell shrugged, but not much. That came later, Jake said. Once the public outcry over the cost of sending them off to remote worlds drowned out the voices of those who urged for compassion. So, your people exterminated all those telepaths, Shinji said angrily, and now that your nation wants them for strategic purposes, you don't have any left. You got what you deserve. I'd say if I were you, Tyrell cautioned. Why? Tyrell locked eyes with Shinji and asked, have you ever heard of the planet Lochist? No, Shinji said, paused then asked, why? It's not there anymore. Jake's voice was loud and strained, but his translator was incapable of conveying the depth of emotion behind his words. During the first wave of exterminations, we killed only telepaths that had committed crimes, but the second wave was different. They were innocent. Males, females, younglings. It didn't matter anymore. The people saw them as outsiders. Jake watched the fighter as it passed through the force field barrier and fired its thrusters to compensate for the gravity within the docking area. That's when they came, he said as he watched the fighter maneuvering. We were nothing to them. We posed no threat and hadn't even known that they existed. We begged and pleaded for mercy, but found none. They couldn't hear our voices. They came in response to the plight of the telepaths and burned our ancestral home to ash. The only people who could have asked them to stop had been sentenced to death by their own brethren. The condemned were carried away to the stars, and their persecutors were left to serve as kindling on the pyre of their own ignorance. Callie fought the impulse to smile. She knew exactly which verses the collective would have sung on that day. The Cletharian ship quietly maneuvered into position at the edge of the central platform. The craft lowered its forward landing struts until they hovered just above the outermost metallic ring. The bulb-like rear section glowed with soft yellow light. The side facing them consisted predominantly of long, cylindrical protrusions which tapered to a point. The spiny protrusions moved as if stirred by the flow of some unseen current. I always wondered. Tyrell mused. The more we come in contact with other species, the more we borrow from one another. Everything becomes more and more standardized as time goes on. But that little ship is a thing of beauty. I can't detect a single recognizable system, and it's a great. That fighter was designed without a shred of outside influence. In my experience, Jake chittered, beauty and danger walk hand in hand. The Cletharians are vile and merciless. It must have been so horrible for them, Callie said, to hear all those minds calling out at once, filled with hopelessness, anguish, and fear. They couldn't just stand by and do nothing. I'm sorry for what happened to your world, but you can't understand what effect something like that has on a single telepath, let alone a collective. Even the greatest of minds would be swept away by the current of their despair. There's a point at which you'd do anything to silence the voices, just to find a moment of peace within that maelstrom of lamentation. You're laying it on a bit thick, Tyrell chuckled. I just want him to understand the degree of impact something like that has on telepaths, Callie said forcefully. If that's your intent, Jake clicked softly. You should stick with terms that can be translated. I didn't hear half of what you said through all the beeping in my ear. Are you serious? Callie said in exasperation. I was teasing. Jake spread his mandibles wide. I turned on the best match option earlier. I think I understood well enough, but the reference to spinning lamentics was confusing. What? Callie gasped. The best match feature is terrible, Tyrell chuckled. I'm pretty sure it's led to at least one war. When I was young, Shinji said, my family was killed because I was born a telepath. I know what it's like to be hunted merely because you exist. I also know what it's like to feel the pain of other telepaths, just not on that kind of scale. I have a serious problem with what your ancestors did, but there's never a valid justification for genocide. They destroyed a single world, Callie scoffed. If their goal was to exterminate the Loctarian race, they would have. While I don't like hearing it, Jake said, there is truth in your words. It was clear that we couldn't challenge the Cletharians, and that they wanted the telepaths, which my people were eager to be rid of. So, we enacted a new policy. A loud hissing noise emanated from the fighter as the rear section slid away from the main body of the craft on long struts which rotated downward until it came to rest on the floor. A thick opaque membrane lined the abdomen-like section where it had detached from the main body of the craft. What did you do? Shinji asked. Jake shifted uncomfortably. It should be obvious, Tyrell snickered. We built remote stations at the edge of our territory and shuttled our aberrants there as offerings to the Horde. The Cletharians would show up, from time to time, collect the telepaths and leave. Did you ever wonder what they wanted with all those telepaths? Callie asked. As long as the Cletharians left us in peace, we didn't care, Jake said with a shrug. I'm not asking about your nation, leaders, or species in general, Callie said with a playful smile. I'm asking you. The membrane on the fighter's docking pod quivered and thinned as the internal and external atmospheric pressures equalized. What would be the point? Jake's demeanor seemed mocking. It's a broken question. I don't see the point in guessing. Turn off that best match feature, Tyrell chuckled. Jake sighed, then reiterated, I see no point in asking questions that can never be answered. Callie grinned broadly as the membrane at the front of the Cletharian pod melted away. The insectal Clether stepped out of the pod onto the central platform. Shinji gasped in surprise as he looked back and forth between their visitor and Jake. Tyrell laughed. I was just wondering, Callie teased. When you said never, was that mistranslated? Jake's entire body seemed to stiffen. The Clether tilted its head from side to side as it approached him. It seemed disinterested in everyone else. Jake stood, paralyzed, before the creature as it slowly circled him. Without refocusing her eyes, she couldn't be sure, but Callie suspected the Clether was using the psionic ability known as mental paralysis on Jake. There was only a subtle hue difference in their exoskeleton coloration. Jake was far more slender than the Clether, and his legs were significantly longer. They both had 4 arms, but unlike the uniformity of Jake's arm length, the Clether had one thick, powerful, elongated pair, and a second set which was short and delicate. Their visitor's legs were short and stumpy, and its torso was longer and widened more at the top. The large hump on its back prevented it from standing as straight as Jake. The overall shape of their heads was almost identical. Even with all the morphological differences, it was clear that the Clether were the descendants of those ancient Loctarian telepaths. "Can we wrap this up?" Callie chuckled. "I want to see the rest of the ship." She telepathically urged the Clether to release Jake from its hold. The Darkling's shadow sped across the floor and up the Clether's outer shell until it came to rest on its back. Jake nearly fell to the floor as the Clether released its hold on his nervous system. The Clether made a high-pitched chittering noise. Jake put one of his hands up to his neck and deactivated his translator's voice functionality. They spoke among themselves as they walked to the center of the platform. It was impossible to discern the nature of the discussion, but it seemed the long-lost cousins had a lot to talk about. The platform activated, and they began their journey toward the main structure of the ship. During the final stage of their ride onto the ship, the baby weaver had flown around the tractor beam and taken a good look at each of them. Jake had seen it before and seemed engrossed in his conversation with the Clether. Tyrell only paid it a passing interest. Callie had insisted she'd explain everything once everyone had gathered, and that was apparently good enough for him. Shinji, on the other hand, was intensely curious about the enigmatic creature and spent most of the trip attempting to make telepathic contact with the Weaver. At first, Callie thought it was afraid of him, but it quickly became clear, to her at least, that the Nautiloid was playing. Shinji didn't catch on to its intent and became more and more frustrated until she reminded him that it was just a baby. A large, empathic baby that could melt his brain if he upset it, but a baby nonetheless. The Weaver didn't seem too happy about being left behind as they passed through a round portal in the underbelly of the ship. The door sealed beneath them, and the tractor beam held them in place. "It's pressurizing the elevator shaft," Tyrell said. "I'm really looking forward to analyzing this technology. They must be maintaining some kind of barrier around the beam to encapsulate the air we've been breathing. I read some articles in a tech journal years ago in which they were proposing something similar, but it was just theoretical. This technology shouldn't exist." "Why not?" Shinji asked. "The project was never funded," Tyrell insisted. "There was no research, planning, testing, or prototype. Whatever designs he may have had were taken with him to the grave." "Someone designed it," Callie chuckled. "What makes you think he's dead?" "I read his obituary," Tyrell scoffed. "I'm surprised that was enough for you," Callie teased. "I'd think those would be easy to fake." "I've falsified a few records in my day," Tyrell admitted, "but that's the easy part. Staying dead is where it gets tricky. All it takes is a trip to a hospital or a biometric scan, and you're suddenly alive again, which leads to a lot of questions. Finding out there are dead people wandering around, wherever they please, tends to make governments nervous." "Unless one of the factions was behind it," Callie grinned. "True enough," Tyrell said, "but I'd imagine being shoved in some dark hole, with no chance of escape, isn't much different from actually being dead." "No," Callie shuddered, "it's not." "How did you escape from PRI?" Shinji asked telepathically. Callie ignored him. "The field deactivated." They were standing on a metal platform in the center of a round room at the base of a long vertical shaft. A clear, glossy barrier stood between them and the white walls beyond. Jake turned to face Callie and said something. She smirked as one of her brown tails reached out toward his throat. He tilted his head slightly and stared at her momentarily. The Clether rested a hand on Jake's shoulder and made clicking noises. Jake rested one hand against the side of his head as he reactivated his translator. "Sorry, I forgot," Jake said. "That's better," Callie smiled. "What did you say?" "I asked where you wanted to go first." "What options do we have?" Shinji asked. Callie smirked. At least Jake knew enough to ask her. Shinji should know better than to. I need to go somewhere with system core access, Tyrell said. I can figure out the rest from there. Take us to Syntholo, Callie said. Kirame, Jake said, waited for a tone to sound, then added, Helm. That's the name of Baron Deloric's ship, Callie said with a start. What does he have to do with any of this? I doubt pirates design their own ships, Tyrell snickered. My guess would be that this is either the prototype or an updated model. He went missing a while back, Callie sighed. I was worried that his ship might have been captured. Is that name actually from the Elder Tongue? Tyrell scoffed, or is it just another sad attempt to add an air of legitimacy? It is, Callie giggled, but it's a weird name for a ship. What does it mean? Shinji asked. I'm not saying, Callie smiled playfully. You giggled, Tyrell demanded, now you have to tell us. I don't have to do anything, she said as she tried not to blush. The name has meaning, Jake said. I am wonder as well. Damn it, Jake, Tyrell snapped. Didn't I tell you to turn off that best match feature? Did the ship accept your command? Callie asked. It doesn't feel like we're moving. Don't change the subject, Tyrell snickered. Just answer the question. What question? Callie asked innocently. Her tails traced the surface of the floor as she looked down and blushed brightly. What does it mean? They asked in unison. The clether made a single high-pitched clicking noise. I'm not going to answer, Callie said firmly. Jake turned off his translator and spoke briefly with his estranged cousin and then began to laugh. I'm guessing your new friend knows the language, Tyrell grumbled. Jake reactivated his translator and adjusted it slightly. You're welcome to ask Jake later, Callie teased, but I'm not saying it. The Terrans have no word that means beep, Jake chittered merrily. I understand why she wouldn't wish to explain the concept. You choose now to turn off best match, Tyrell scoffed. Jake turned to Callie and said, the only sentient Kirame species I'm familiar with are the Icarians. The computer beeped. One of the factions destroyed their homeworld, Callie scowled, and then blamed it on Cletheria. I hope they're able to find a new breeding ground, Jake said. I'm sure they'll recover, Callie said with a grin. It's hard to kill off a race of Kirame, otherwise the Xenon would have been wiped out long ago. The computer beeped again. Okay, Tyrell said, I think I've got the gist of it. A different tone sounded. What does it mean? Shinji asked irritably. That noise is just to let us know we've arrived, Jake said, and to warn us to step away from the walls. I wasn't asking about the beep, Shinji grumbled. The white wall, beyond the transparent barrier, separated into two panels, which drew back until it formed a semicircle around them. Beyond the clear wall, everything was immersed so deeply in shadow, it seemed to darken the well-lit elevator shaft. Callie could feel anxiety emanating from the darkling. Its shadow rested against the wall at the furthest point from the strange umbral boundary. Callie's tails stirred restlessly as she approached the transparent barrier. The Clether spoke. Jake nodded. Callie rested her hand against the glassy wall. She said their shadows must never touch, Jake said. You're going to have to find a way to get Syntholo to calm down. You're sure all this inky blackness is just him? Callie asked. I knew he was, Jake said, but I didn't expect this. He's been in there stewing in his rage for all this time. I've developed a rapport with him, Tyrell said. Do you want me to talk to him? It has to be me, Callie said sternly. I'm the only one that can get to where he is. What does that even mean? Shinji asked. Where is he? Callie reached out and gently caressed the mind of the young weaver and reassured it that she'd return as she gently withdrew her connection from it. She was grateful he had left his weapons on the regicide one. The intensity of his rage was daunting. Her chances of walking out of that room unscathed were virtually non-existent, but there was no reason to risk lives other than her own. Keep the little one company, she directed her thoughts to the collective. I will not subject it to this. I can't take this with me, she said as she took off the chameleon coat and tossed it to Tyrell. She coiled her tails around herself, took a deep breath, and stepped through the barrier into the dark miasma beyond.